Across the history of the NFL, going all the way back to the 1930s, there have been some undeniably brilliant acquisitions for teams. Of course, there have been some flops as well, but in this video we'll be looking at 11 of the most influential acquisitions across the NFL's storied past. Before we hop in, be sure to like and subscribe to get the latest from Superb Sports Media as it's posted. First up on our list is Dutch Clark, aka the Flying Dutchman. As quarterback for the defunct Portsmouth Spartans, Dutch Clark signed with the Detroit Lions in 1934. That year, Clark led the NFL with 1,146 yards of total offense. That was a lot in the 30s, and was selected as the first-team All-Pro quarterback for the third time in his career. With a 10-3 season under his belt, the next year would cement why Clark was such a clutch signing. 1935, he took the Lions to a 7-3-2 record, along with an NFL championship. In 1936, he led the NFL in scoring, while taking the Lions to an 8-4 record, the third best in the NFL. Dutch Clark would spend the next 2 years as a player-coach for the Lions with a total record of 14-8. After the 1938 season, he hung up his cleats for the Lions to coach instead. But his legacy in the NFL, and especially for the Lions, was intact. Dutch was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1963, and rightfully so. Oh, I almost forgot to mention that Clark was not just a quarterback, but also played running back, wide receiver, and place kicker. Strong start for this list. When you talk about electrifying players in the 1930s, you have to talk about Don Hudson and his incredible signing with the Green Bay Packers. Hudson was offered a staggering $300 per game by the Packers when he signed in 1935, far more than what they had ever paid any other player. Hudson was a star for the Packers right out of the gate, reeling in an 83-yard touchdown pass on his first play from scrimmage. You have to remember, in 1935, no one had ever seen this level of skill or speed from a wide receiver. The following year, Hudson and the Packers soared through the season, winning the NFL championship and the Packers' fourth league title. In total, Hudson would go on to help the Packers win 3 total NFL championships and set numerous records along the way, including, but not limited to, 5 seasons leading the league in scoring, 8 seasons leading the league in receptions, and 7 seasons with the most receiving yards. Those records still stand today. Hudson was also inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1963. To the 1940s we go with one of the biggest trades of the decade, with quarterback Sid Luckman moving from the Chicago Cardinals to the Chicago Bears. The trade itself is considered the second biggest of the franchise, sitting just behind the trade that got the Bears NFL legend Dick Butkus. Luckman not only led the Bears to 4 NFL titles during 12 seasons, including 1940, 1941, 1943, and 1946, Luckman is considered to be one of the greatest long-range passers of all time, and played a key role in revolutionizing pro football by helping to introduce the T formation. Coached by George Halas, Sid Luckman and the Chicago Bears were nearly unstoppable, with only 1 season under 500 and 10 seasons with 3 or fewer losses, including an undefeated season, minus the championship, in 1942. Sitting on the bench behind Luckman in 1948 is the next player on our list of insane acquisitions, Bobby Layne. He wasn't just behind Luckman, though. In 1948, Bobby Layne was the 3rd-string quarterback on the Bears. So when he was traded to the Detroit Lions in 1950, he had to be itching for playing time. The trade to the Lions would mark a turning of the tides, as Layne led the Lions to an NFL championship in 1952, 1953, and 1957, just missing out on a three-peat in 1954 when they lost to the Cleveland Browns. Layne was so influential as a Lions quarterback that they retired his number. We won't focus on it, but we have to touch on Layne's parting words to the Lions when he was traded away to the Steelers in 1958. Layne reportedly said the Lions would not win for 50 years. They've still yet to win a Super Bowl. Their last playoff win was in 1992, and they are one of 2 teams to go 0-16. The curse of Bobby Layne? Yeah, definitely possible. After getting kicked in the head so hard he suffered a fracture to his skull, you'd think a man would retire from the game of football. But not true of Elroy Crazy Legs Hirsch. In 1949, the Los Angeles Rams signed Hirsch to a major contract after a bidding war. After donning one of the first helmets ever in the NFL, made of a fighter plane plastic, Hirsch began setting almost every tight end record possible. While snagging an NFL record 1,495 receiving yards in 1950, Crazy Legs and the Rams won an NFL championship. In total, the Rams appeared in the playoffs over half the seasons with Hirsch, and even secured the first major broadcast rights for an NFL team to have their games televised. To do well as a receiver, you need to have a good quarterback, and Crazy Legs Hirsch had that in the form of Norm Van Brocklin. But as Hirsch was headed out of the NFL, Van Brocklin was traded from the Rams to the Philadelphia Eagles after coming out of retirement in 1958. The Rams received 2 players and a first-round pick, but the Eagles got the better end of the bargain. With Van Brocklin at the helm and given full control of the offense, the Eagles improved year over year, finally winning it all in 1960. That NFL championship for the Eagles would be the last championship for 57 years and mark the final season in the NFL for Van Brocklin. In the initial trade, Van Brocklin was promised a head coaching gig with the Eagles when he retired, but after hanging up his cleats post-championship, the Eagles reneged and Van Brocklin headed to Minnesota to become the first coach of the Minnesota Vikings. Moving to the other side of the ball, we come to Gino the Giant Marchetti, who landed with the Baltimore Colts in 1953. In his early days with the Colts, Marchetti was a brutish enforcer, dominating opponents on both sides of the ball, but ultimately finding his home on the defensive side of the ball at an end parole. His toughness was never in question and was on full display when he laid a big hit on New York Giants legend Frank Gifford in the 1958 NFL Championship. The hit stopped Frank Gifford short of a first down, but also fractured Marchetti's ankle. He'd watched the rest of the game from the sidelines as the Colts won the championship, but came back in the next season to win the championship once again in 1959. Gino the Giant peaked in the following year when he led the NFL in sacks with 11. Marchetti made it to the Pro Bowl 11 times and was selected to the first-team All-Pro team 9 times. His importance to the Baltimore Colts led to his number being retired, his induction into the Baltimore Ring of Honor, and, ultimately, an induction into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. One of Marchetti's teammates is synonymous with Colts football, but you'd never believe how he got there. Would you believe that Johnny Unitas was released by the Steelers because he wasn't good enough to be one of 3 quarterbacks? Walt Kiesling's trash turned into Colts coach Weeb Eubanks' treasure as Unitas joined the Colts in 1956. Unitas' real first game action resulted in a pick-6 against the Chicago Bears, followed by a fumble lost and recovered by the Bears on the very next play. From that start to winning the NFL MVP in the following season, Johnny Unitas was quickly building his legacy. Another notch in the belt was winning the NFL championship for the Colts in 1958 and 1959, winning the MVP again in 1959. Unitas would lead the Colts in their winning ways, notching 2 more MVP seasons, but losing the NFL championship in 1964. Still cranking out winning seasons and consistently ranked in the top tier of quarterbacks season to season, the Colts and Unitas rolled into Super Bowl III in 1968 with a 15-1 record, ultimately losing to young upstart Joe Namath and his New York Jets. At 37 years old, Unitas took the Colts back to the Super Bowl again 2 years later in Super Bowl V, where Unitas and team topped the Dallas Cowboys 16-13. Unitas' last season with the Colts was in 1972, where, after a slow 1-4 start, the Colts fired their head coach and Unitas found himself riding the bench. Traded to San Diego the next year, Unitas sits in a special class of quarterbacks whose output is nearly unmatched to this day. While Unitas was dominating the NFL with the Colts in the AFC, the Dallas Cowboys were about to add their own secret weapon under center. Trading away their next year's first and sixth round pick in the NFL draft to the Washington Redskins, the Cowboys were able to talk Eddie LeBaron out of retirement in 1960 for their inaugural season. Known to his teammates as the Little General, the 5'7" LeBaron was the shortest quarterback ever selected to the Pro Bowl and was voted in 4 separate times, including once with the Dallas Cowboys. Look, we're not going to lie to you. LeBaron's time was not necessarily great. His first season with the Cowboys, they went winless with a 0-11-1 record, but he did kick off what would become one of the biggest football dynasties in the NFL. And for that, his acquisition by the Cowboys makes this list. In a major battle for superstardom, the St. Louis Cardinals and the New York Jets went toe-to-toe over who would get a young man with a lingering knee injury named Joe Namath. The Jets won out, and the legend of Broadway Joe began. A slow start to the season gave way to a strong end, such a strong emergence by Joe Namath that he won the AFL Rookie of the Year. 2 years later, in 1967, he set a new quarterbacking precedent as the first QB to throw for more than 4,000 yards in a season. Keep in mind that was only in 14 games. With no shortage of bravado, Namath took the Jets to Super Bowl III in 1968, confidently saying, though out of frustration, that he guaranteed the Jets would beat the Johnny Unitas-led Baltimore Colts. In the first major win for the AFL in the Super Bowl, Namath threw for 206 yards, but more importantly, taking care of the ball with no interceptions thrown. The Jets' defense, on the other hand, picked off the Colts 4 times, sealing a 16-7 victory. The Jets and Namath would make the playoffs again in 1969, but that would be the last time until 1981. Hampered by the lingering knee injury, Namath underwent 4 knee operations, even getting his knee drained at halftime in some instances to keep him upright. With waning health, the Jets waived Namath in 1977, but his impact on the Jets and the AFL is felt well after he left. After a strange start to his career, the next player on our list was part of a 5-player trade to the Minnesota Vikings. From that point on in 1961, Jim Marshall became one of the NFL's Iron Men, setting a then record 282 consecutive games played, 270 of those with the Minnesota Vikings. As one of the key members of the Purple People Eaters, Marshall recovered 30 fumbles and sacked opposing quarterbacks 127 times during his career with the Vikings as a defensive end. While his time with the Vikings was prolific, there was one moment that must have made the Norm Van Brocklin coach Vikings scratch their heads about if they'd made a mistake in getting Marshall. The date was October 25th, 1964, and Jim Marshall scooped up a fumble from the opposing 49ers. 66 yards later, he was in the end zone, celebrating alone, and threw the ball out of the back of the end zone. The only problem, it was his own end zone. The wrong way run, as it has become known, resulted in a safety that thankfully did not cost the Vikings the win. Years removed from one of the most ridiculous moments in NFL history, Marshall and the Vikings would go on to win the 1969 NFL Championship, which was the last to be played. 7 days later, the Vikings lost Super Bowl IV, but would become a perennial powerhouse for the rest of Marshall's career. He played in 4 total Super Bowls for the Vikings and was elected to the Pro Bowl twice, before retiring in 1979. Marshall is considered to be one of the biggest Hall of Fame snubs of all time. We're 11 players in and are creeping out of the 1960s and into the 1970s and beyond, but that's a video for another day. Which of the players discussed would you most want to have on your roster? Let us know in the comments below, and let us know who we should make sure to touch on in our 1970s and beyond video. If you haven't already, take a look at our last video where we went through some of the most intriguing defunct teams to ever grace the NFL. Also, be sure to like and subscribe to make sure you see when our next video is released. Thanks for watching.